didn't need me to tell you that. You've got your own user telling you that already. But what's worse is that because a lot of our software straddles the boundary between two different protection domains, particularly because a lot of it is exposed to the internet, and also it has access to data we would like to keep secret, our software has security bugs. Now, this is more obvious in a server-related project like Apache or OpenSSL, or in server cloud infrastructure projects like Xen. But as we saw with the shell shock vulnerability, even a project like Ash can have a surprising amount of exposure to the outside world. And so when we discover security-related bugs in our projects, our security response process will have a major impact on how our users are exposed to that vulnerability. Now, you may say our software project doesn't have a security response process, but that's not really true. You can't have no philosophy of life. You can only have a good philosophy of life or a bad one. If you're religious, you can't have no theology. You can only have good theology or bad theology. And similarly, if you have a software project, you can't have no security response process. You can only have a good one or a bad one. Now, just like philosophy of life and theology, there are lots of different ideas as to what constitutes a good security response process. But I hope we can all agree that one that is deliberately chosen after careful consideration is better than one that just happens by accident. So, the Xen hypervisor is it's used by large cloud providers, by Fortune 500 companies, by thousands of smaller cloud providers and shops. And to help those users minimize their exposure to vulnerabilities, several years ago instituted a security response process. And we have been tweaking and modifying that according to our experience ever since. So what I'd like to do today is to talk a bit about why we made the decisions that we made, how we got to the point that we are now. Some of that was based on the experience of the industry as a whole, but a lot of the details were based on our own experiences interacting with it. So my goal today, if you are involved in a software project, is to convince you to think and decide about your security response process, to equip you with some of the sort of basic theory to design one if you decide you want to do more than you're doing already, and to share some of the pitfalls that we have encountered so that you can learn the easy way from our mistakes rather than the hard way from your own mistakes. And if you're a user, I hope that this gives you more insight into the security response process in general. One, so that you can interact with it better, but two, so that you can have more confidence in the security of the software that we use every day. Right, so let's start with the basics. And I realize that a lot of this would be familiar to a lot of the people in the room already, but bear with me as I kind of catch everybody up so we're on the same page. Right, so if you didn't know any better, you might think that the best security response process would be someone finds a bug, they email the software vendor or the software project, and then they wait for them to fix it, right? The problem, and so this is called no disclosure, and the problem is that doesn't really work. So unfortunately, users tend to confuse the absence of evidence with the evidence of absence. So there's a perverse incentive here, right? So if you tell your users, hey, we fixed this bug, we fixed this bug, we fixed this bug, what they hear is, there was a bug, there was a bug, there was a bug. Whereas if you just don't mention the security bugs that you have, users assume that they're perfectly secure. They'll live under that illusion. So there's a temptation for software vendors and software projects to sweep security things under the rug. Okay, so just telling the software project about the bug doesn't really work. So because there's a risk they'll cover it up instead of fixing it, maybe you should just tell everybody, right? Just make the bug public. After all, users have a right to know their software is vulnerable, right? So this is called full disclosure, and it does work in the sense that it will get those bugs fixed as quickly as possible. But as quickly as possible is still an awfully long time if you are standing there vulnerable. It takes time to find and test a fix. It takes time to roll out that deployment. So during all that time, between the time that the bug was made public and the time that users can actually apply that binary fix, they are at far more risk than they were before the vulnerability went public. You see, when a bug hasn't been made public yet, users are vulnerable, but they're what might be called privately vulnerable. The only people who know about the bug are the small number of people who have done the hard work of finding the bug themselves, or other people who have bought it or some other way found out about it. And the value of that private vulnerability to that small group of people lies in the fact that nobody knows about it. Nobody knows about it, it can't be patched. So that it's in the interest of those people to keep that bug as secret as possible. Every time they use the vulnerability, every person they tell it to, every person they sell it to, increases the risk that it will be made public and will drop dramatically in value. So to maintain the value of that vulnerability, people typically only exploit very particular high-value targets. So as a consequence, the risk from a private vulnerability to any random user is relatively low. Now, in the case of a public vulnerability, all that is turned. So instead of only a handful of people knowing about the vulnerability, now everybody knows about it. There are millions of people who have the potential to use that vulnerability against you. And there's no longer any reason to be selective about who you exploit. On the contrary, there's an incentive to exploit as many people as you can before the vulnerability gets patched. So, a public vulnerability exposes far more users to far more risk than a private vulnerability. And full disclosure reduces the amount of time that users are privately vulnerable by making them publicly vulnerable for the inevitable amount of time that it takes to actually roll out a fix. So out of this, a compromise was born. This is called coordinated disclosure, or sometimes it's called responsible disclosure. The person who finds the bug says, look, this is important that users know about this bug. But I recognize that simply knowing the bug exists isn't going to help most users to defend themselves. So here's what I'll do. I am going to make this bug public, but first I'm going to tell you, the software vendor, the software project, about the bug so that you have time to fix it. Right, so here we have the basic shape of coordinated disclosure, and unfortunately that's off the side, isn't it? Okay, the reporter tells the software vendor, and they coordinate on time to release the details of both the vulnerability and the fix. Now, when you get to open source projects, there's an extra step. So most people don't get their software directly from the software projects themselves. Instead, they get their binaries from distributions or from software vendors who have repackaged the software. So waiting to tell the world about this vulnerability until the software project had released a software patch wouldn't help most users because they would still be publicly vulnerable until their distributions managed to give them a binary patch. So for open source project, there's simply an extra step called pre-disclosure. During pre-disclosure, details about the vulnerability and the fix are given to a select group of people to allow them to make and to test binary updates which fix the vulnerability. Now, historically, this list would have only been distributions, or maybe distributions plus software vendors who are repackaging the software. But with the rise of cloud computing, many end users are effectively get their software neither from the upstream project nor from distributions, but from the service providers. So waiting to make a public announcement, before making the public announcement until the distributions had binary fixes, wouldn't help users of, say, Amazon or Rackspace. They would still be vulnerable to other users on that system until a binary fix was able to get out. So in the XenProject, and I think a lot of projects do this now, we include service providers, public cloud providers, on our pre-disclosure list as well. Okay, so that's the introduction, the basic shape of the Xen security response process. We've got an email alias, security@xenproject.org, that goes to our security team. When they receive a report, they try and find a fix. They mail the announcement pre-disclosure list, and they coordinate a public disclosure. So a couple more details, things here to fill out. So it's important to remember, if you are a software project, that reporters don't have to participate in your response process. Full disclosure is always an option to anyone who doesn't agree with your process. And so to encourage people to participate, you need to make it clear that you honor the wishes of the reporter as much as you are able to do so. That said, many people who report bugs don't really have an idea how long they want the disclosure to be. So, and most people are willing to cooperate with reasonable requests. So our policy has a recommended timeline. So 1 week, ideally, between the time that the initial disclosure is made, the bug is reported, and they do the pre-disclosure. And 2 weeks between the time the pre-disclosure is made and the time of the public release. Right, so those are the basics, and as long as everything is going well, a basic policy like that will work. But it's when things start to go wrong and your policy is tested that you will learn the little corners of things that don't quite work. So our policy has had 2 major revisions, both in response to specific incidences that exposed some weakness in the policy. So the first was what happened around XSA7. XSA7 was the Intel sysret vulnerability. It had to do with slight differences in the implementation of the sysret instruction between AMD and between Intel, such that if you wrote your operating system according to the AMD spec, and then took that software and ran it on Intel hardware, it was trivial to break right through into the operating system. So most major operating systems had been vulnerable at some point, including Linux, FreeBSD, NetBSD, Windows 7, and because Xen uses the syscall and sysret for hypercalls, Xen was also vulnerable. Right, so at that time, only large cloud providers were on the pre-disclosure list, where large was kind of arbitrarily defined as having 300,000 or more machines with Xen deployed on them. So someone discovered the vulnerability, they reported to the security team. The fix was pretty easy, so this team mailed the pre-disclosure list and set the public release date 2 weeks after the initial disclosure. Unfortunately, one of the cloud providers on the list didn't miss the pre-disclosure announcement. So now the company in question is still involved in the XenProject, and this is all water under the bridge at this point, so I'm going to call this company Phoenix Corporation. So the email address from Phoenix Corporation that was on the list was not an alias that went to a team of people, but it was an individual at that company. Now, it seems that for whatever reason, maybe the individual was on vacation, maybe they left the company, the message about XSA7 didn't get to the right people. And so during most of the 2-week pre-disclosure period, Phoenix Corporation was blissfully unaware that the bug even existed. They only discovered their impending doom 3 days before the vulnerability was scheduled to be made public. Right, so here we find the first lesson from this. So none of what follows would have happened if Phoenix Corporation had had an email alias on the pre-disclosure list, rather than that had gone to a team of people, rather than to an individual. So it's now part of our security policy that all email addresses on our list have to go to a team to keep this from happening in the future. Right, so back to Phoenix Corporation. With 3 days before the public announcement of a vulnerability that allowed anyone running a 64-bit VM to break into their hypervisors, they panicked. We can't possibly test and deploy a fix to hundreds of thousands of servers with only 3 days lead time. So they contacted the security team and they demanded that the public disclosure date be pushed back. Now, the security team was reluctant to do so. So first of all, they said, look, we've already coordinated with the reporter and we've agreed on this date for the public release, so we definitely have the authority to push it back. Secondly, we're not sure we could push it back even if we wanted to. We've already told people this is the date we can make this public. We can't be sure that everyone will, even if we ask people to push it back, that they can, that first of all that they'll get the message, and second of all that they'll be managed to actually comply. And finally, look, you guys are not the only ones with this problem. All of the users of Xen who are not on this list are vulnerable at this moment. And what you're asking us to do is extend the time that they are vulnerable because you screwed up. And that just doesn't seem right. Well, Phoenix Corporation didn't accept that. They continued calling and emailing members of the XenProject security team at Citrix, trying to pressure them into changing the disclosure date. The CEO of Phoenix Corporation called the CEO of Citrix to try to get him to order some of the people on the security team to push the disclosure date back. Now, to their credit, the management chain at Citrix handled this very well. So the CEO of Citrix didn't know what this was about. He called VP of our office. The VP of our office told him, look, the members of the security team are acting as representatives of the XenProject. They have to be free to make decisions for the good of that project. So the CEO of Citrix called back the CEO of Phoenix Corporation and said, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. Now, this is something that went well. You can easily imagine how this could have gone badly, right? So one lesson to learn from this is to make sure ahead of time that your management chain, your company know how important it is that decisions of the security team be made in the interests of the community as a whole, and not be interfered with by corporate politics. Another lesson to learn from this is to try to get diversity on your security team. So one of the things that probably helped in this situation was the fact that our security team at that time, as now, is made up of people from several different organizations. This makes the team as a whole much less susceptible to this sort of pressure. Right, so that didn't work. There was one last thing that Phoenix Corporation did. It is standard practice in your public disclosure to give credit to the person who found it. At the time of XSA7, we also gave credit in the pre-disclosure. So, Phoenix Corporation called the reporter, and the reporter's CEO, and tried to get them to ask for the disclosure date to be pushed back. And this time, they succeeded. So under pressure, the reporter asked for the disclosure date to be pushed back. And since our security policy said we will try to honor the wish of the reporter, the security team didn't feel like they had any other option. So 3 hours before the public disclosure of the vulnerability, they emailed the pre-disclosure list and asked people not to publish the updates. And rather miraculously, everyone got the message and managed to comply. So the public disclosure of the vulnerability ended up with one thing and another being pushed back for another 6 weeks. So part of the problem with that, to take it aside, there were other projects that were also vulnerable, right? So there was actually a long coordination process, anyway. But, okay, 6 weeks, that was it. So, okay, so this exact situation isn't going to happen to you because you're going to put aliases on your pre-disclosure list, right? But you can certainly imagine situations where there might be temptation for some member of the pre-disclosure list to put pressure on the reporter for their own benefit and for the detriment of the community as a whole. So to prevent this from happening, we only credit the reporter in the public disclosure and not on the pre-disclosure. Right. Well, this ended the crisis for Phoenix Corporation, but a lot of the core developers were pretty upset. We felt that Phoenix Corporation had abused their position of privilege on the pre-disclosure list at the expense of all users of Xen and the other cloud providers who were not on the list. But I do think it's worth stepping back a minute and asking a slightly different question. So when I started to write this talk, it seemed really obvious to me that the decision that the security team had made at that time on standing on principle was the right one. But as I've gone over the history of XSA7, I'm not so sure anymore. So what would have happened to Phoenix Corporation if that vulnerability had gone public as initially planned, with them completely unprepared? What would have happened to the XenProject? What would happen to cloud computing in general? Would it really have been that bad for the security team to have gone back to the reporter and said, is it okay if we have another week? It's not really that clear to me. But one thing that was really clear was just how unfair our policy was to medium and small cloud providers. So we saw how panicked Phoenix Corporation was when they realized they only had 3 days before this vulnerability was going to be made known to the entire world. So imagine the feeling of there's thousands of medium and small cloud providers when they realized that, when they saw the vulnerability, and they realized that already was known to the entire world. Now, of course, the reason that we had initially limited the membership to large cloud providers was every person you add to the pre-disclosure list increases the risk that someone is going to misuse that information. But at this point, we felt like, a lot of us felt like that, that risk was actually pretty small compared to the unfairness that it generated. So after the public disclosure of XSA7, we had a discussion in our community about who could be on the pre-disclosure list. As you might imagine, there were lots of different opinions, and it wasn't an easy discussion, but in the end, we decided to open up the list to all public cloud providers. And that's where it stands today. So any company, you can go to the website, you can open up an account, you can make a VM, can be on the pre-disclosure list. So if your project makes a pre-disclosure list, think very carefully about who you put on it, and think about the consequences of favoring one group over another. Right. And I aimed this talk for 25 minutes, and apparently only have 20 minutes. Really briefly, let me just go through these real quick. Sorry about this. Users don't know when an update is coming. So one of the things we changed is we tell people in the pre-disclosure, so we publicly announce this is when a new thing is going to come out. Okay? And obviously I don't have time to go over the second big thing. I don't really have time to tell the story. But having told you that in the XenProject we give you the date that we're going to tell you the pre-disclosure, I wouldn't be, be very nice to you if I didn't tell you there's a negative side effect of that. Because having something that is a very specific date where something very important is going to come out and no one who has any information about it is allowed to say anything is really great for the media as well. Okay, they can speculate endlessly with almost no information. And for this, well, basically we don't have a good answer to this. We think it's important that users know when something's going to come out, and there's no way that users can know without the media knowing as well. So, I think with that, I will take some questions. If you want to ask details about what these mean,
What if the alias only has one person on the end of it?
I mean, there's only so much you can do, right? I mean, the initial policy said we recommend that there be somebody, and I mean, a lot of public cloud providers only have like 3 or 4 people working for them. Well, it's the small ones, so there only is one person who could even be on the list. But just the fact of saying you have to have actually an alias, we're hoping for larger groups will really kind of they have to do something specific to do the wrong thing, I guess. Should say that. Yeah.
Hello. What would happen if during the time you are working on the patch, someone else discovers the same issue? They contact you, like 2 people, independent people find the same issue.
Right.
And the first one is already in that period when it's scheduled to be fixed in the future. Mm-hmm. And how this is handled?
I think we would probably say, so this is a more detailed policy. So my guess would be that we would say, thank you for the disclosure. We will do X and X. Yeah, actually, so we probably would just tell them. Actually, someone already found that vulnerability, because the reason you wouldn't tell someone about it is because you don't want them to know about it. If they told you about the vulnerability, obviously they know about it. So there's no risk in saying, actually, we already know about that and we're going to fix it. Were you asking about anything else? Does that answer your question? About the credit, or?
Yeah.
Right.
Would you provide the credit?
I don't really know. It doesn't hurt to say put both names on there, or to say this was also reported by X. I don't know.
So now sort of anyone who starts a ISP can be on the list?
That's what the security policy says, yes.
That means then any DHQ or NSA, they could be on the list and they can abuse the vulnerability for the list time it's not disclosed.
There's a risk, yeah. So all these things are like a balance, right? And I think it's easy to look at. It's easy to only look at sort of one side of things, right? So it was easy to sort of to look only at the large cloud providers and say, well, they need something, and not notice the thousands of people who were small and just don't think about the experience that they have. And so it's only, typically it's only 2 weeks. And they no doubt have other ways of finding out, even if they weren't on the list.
More questions?
I vaguely recall an instance when you delayed notifying the pre-disclosure list in favor of, I believe, 2 other agencies that were using your software. I'm not sure how recent that was.
I don't know about the incident, so I don't. Sorry. I'm not actually on the security team, so I sort of look at this from the outside. And I sat next to the people as people were calling them and all this crazy stuff was happening. Okay, so all of the little 20 things that or all of our lessons ended up in one way or another in our security response policy. So if you wanted to take that, and so that kind of gives you a big laundry list of all the different things to think about. And yeah, if you have any feedback or questions or comments, then here's my address. Thank you.
Thank you, George.